Okay, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for your interest in the draft environmental impact report for the Woodland Flood Risk Management Project. And thanks for joining us this evening, taking time out from your night. My name is Kim Floyd and I'm a public outreach consultant to the city and the facilitator for tonight's meeting. In a moment, I'll reintroduce Ken Hyatt, the city manager, to provide a welcome. But I'd like to go over the format for the meeting before doing so. Rick, next slide, please. So we really wish we could have met in person, but under the circumstances, that's not possible. But we didn't want to go without a meeting on this important issue either. So we will do the best that we can tonight, and we appreciate your patience and understanding with the limits of our technology. To start, we'll ask that everyone please mute your phones. And if you're using both phone and computer like I am, the phone for audio, please mute your computer speakers so when you do speak, we won't get feedback. We won't be taking public comment for the official record during this meeting. We will be asking that all comments be submitted in writing. But we do want to be able to take and answer questions for those needing clarification on information in the draft report. We will ask that everyone hold their questions until the end of the presentation, and that if you'd like to ask a question, if you're participating by computer, please use the raise hand button at the middle bottom of your screen. And I'll keep track of the question queue and call on people in order. If you're participating only by phone, it looks like we have 5 people doing that. You can raise your hand by pressing *9. Once everyone's had the opportunity to ask a question, and we do ask that you keep it to one question to start so everyone has a chance to speak, we'll circle back to those who have more than one. And I'll go over these again before we start the Q&A, but with that, I'll turn it over to your new city manager, Ken Hyatt, for a welcome.
Thank you, Kim. I hope everybody can hear me well. Welcome to the draft EIR public meeting for the Woodland Flood Risk Management Project, and thank you all especially for accommodating this virtual format. Planning for the flood protection for Woodland, as you know, has been an ongoing effort since the 90s. Woodland currently is the only city in the Sacramento Valley that does not have a plan to meet FEMA 100-year and state 200-year flood protection. The city has partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, and Department of Water Resources to study flood protection alternatives since the previous plan failed in 2003. Current efforts include the Army Corps of Engineers Lower Cache Creek Feasibility Study, which just recently completed the agency decision milestone and is currently on a path for completion of the feasibility study by next summer. The primary purpose of the draft EIR, it's the subject of this meeting, is to analyze and also disclose the potential environmental impacts of the proposed project consistent with the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act, and will be used as we proceed with completion of the Lower Cache Creek feasibility study. The Woodland Flood Risk Management Project would remove the city from the FEMA regulatory floodplain and also meet the state urban levee design criteria. The city's preferred alternative also includes measures to reduce flood risk north of the city. This includes drainage improvements to drain floodwaters more quickly, as well as an array of actions to help property owners that would remain in the floodplain. These include non-structural measures to assist residences north of the city of Woodland, subsidized flood insurance, purchase of flood easements on properties where the frequency of flooding does not change, but where there is an increase in depth of flooding. So we all know there's still much work to be done before the project can be constructed. And this is really not the final phase, but an important milestone. The feasibility study that the Corps is preparing to complete must first be finalized, and then Congress would need to authorize the project and ultimately provide construction funding. After this, the project will need to be designed and engineered, and then land acquired and assembled necessary to construct that designed facility. Under an optimistic scenario, construction is at least 5 years out from today. And I will close with stating that the city remains committed to continuing to work with the Army Corps, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, Yolo County to ensure maintenance of the existing Cache Creek levee system continues with the proposed project. That has been a subject of much importance we have heard throughout the public process, and will remain committed to work with those entities to ensure that the maintenance of the existing facility is continued to be maintained. I will now turn it over to Tim Bush, Principal Engineer for the city, to walk you through some more specifics about the proposed project. Our team is here today to answer any questions that folks have on this call regarding the project, with the ultimate goal of making sure that there's a good understanding of what the proposed project is, as that will help inform the comments on the draft environmental impact report. So with that, Tim, I will hand it back to you.
All right, thank you, Ken. Hi, good evening. This is Tim Bush. I'm the Principal Utilities Engineer for the City of Woodland, Project Manager for the city's for the efforts on flood protection for the city. I'd like to introduce the team on the call today that will help walk through the slideshow we prepared for tonight, and also take questions. First, I'd like to apologize a little bit for having to reschedule this meeting. We are all learning Zoom, and the fact that if you change a tiny part of the meeting, we have to kind of start all over. So apologize for rescheduling from 2 weeks ago until today. But first, look at the team introduction. On the call today, we have both Rick Reinhardt and Sandy Core from MBK. They are the city's program engineers, helping us navigate the Corps of Engineers process through the feasibility study, helping the city work with both the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and Department of Water Resources on putting together an overall project for the city and surrounding areas. Rick will be doing the bulk of the presentation tonight. Also on the call today, we have Sarah Martin from ICF. Sarah is the project manager for ICF that put together the draft environmental impact report, which is kind of the main purpose of the meeting tonight. Two real goals of the meeting tonight is to meet the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA. That requires that we put together a draft environmental impact report to go over the environmental impacts of the overall project, mainly disclosure document that's done ahead of actually doing the construction project. And then the other purpose of the meeting is to get public comments or start soliciting public comments on the draft EIR for the overall woodland flood risk management project. Comments are due to the city by the end of day on August 14th. Anytime you want to send them in through the end of the day is fine with me. With that, I will turn it over to Rick to do the presentation.
Thanks, Tim. This is Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers. I want to start with just giving a little historical context for how we got to where we are in the study process. There's a long history of flooding on Cache Creek. This slide shows a series of the years where the levee system's overtopped. We've had recently frequent overtopping, meaning that it's around a 10-year event when this levee system starts to overtop. Most recently, on February 27th of 2019, we had a flood event that was below the advertised capacity, but resulted in overtopping in two locations, one on the north bank, just downstream of the town of Yolo, and one on the right bank, just downstream of Road 113. Through flood fighting efforts, we didn't have a failure at those locations. We also had a flood fight at Huff's Corner. We had some heavy seepage that was, I think it was ultimately determined to be from burrowing rodents, but had a flood fight with the assistance of UWR that ultimately saved that levee. So there's real flood risk out here that we've seen firsthand as recently as last year. This is the existing conditions floodplain that the Army Corps developed for the study, and it isn't exactly the same as the FEMA floodplain. There's differences in FEMA mapping criteria, but this is the floodplain that is the basis for the Corps determining what is the without project damages that occur when this levee system fails. They look at do a structure inventory, look at the number of residents looking at that live in the floodplain, to look at loss of life risk, and this really builds the case for why an action is necessary from a state and federal perspective. The city's goals are to reduce risk of damage to property and infrastructure, reduce risk to public health, life, safety from flooding of Lower Cache Creek and the City of Woodland and the surrounding area, and doing so in a way that comply with state and federal regulations. Ken covered a little bit of the background on how we got here. After the feasibility study failed in 2003, the city partnered with the county, the Yolo County Flood Control Water Conservation District, to conduct flood safe YOLO. And that was resetting, coming out of the lack of community support for the 2003 plan, starting from scratch. What is the full array of actions? Everything from upstream, on stream storage, to off-stream storage, to setback levees, to strengthening existing levees, to bypasses, to allowing purchase of flowage easements and water flowing to the north up to the ridge cut. A very, very comprehensive analysis. That narrowed down and became the starting point for the Corps' current Lower Cache Creek feasibility study and the work that the city's been continuing with DWR under their urban flood risk reduction grant. The city's also refined the floodplain modeling with FEMA that ultimately reduce the size of the FEMA 100-year floodplain to make sure that we weren't overestimating who was at risk and requiring flood insurance where mandatory flood insurance wasn't appropriate. And since the 2003 plan failed, we've also had state pass Senate Bill 5, which establishes a 200-year standard for development in urban areas in the California Central Valley. And as importantly, it directed the Department of Water Resources to prepare a draft Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to adopt that plan, which laid out the vision, both from a project's perspective and a policy's perspective of how the state was going to manage flood risks in ways that not only benefited the urban areas, but also the rural areas, the small communities, and also enhance the severely degraded ecosystems in the Central Valley. There's also the integrated water management planning process, which is local agencies consolidate their projects and communicate through a consistent manner with the state for grant funds. And then after the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan was initially adopted in 2012, that SB 5 legislation also required the plan to be updated every 5 years. And there was a lot of controversy around the 2012 plan, specifically in the Yola bypass and the plan's proposal to widen the Yola bypass. What the Department of Water Resources and Central Valley Flood Protection Board did to address that public concern that a plan was developed that wasn't based on broad community input is they developed grants for 6 regions in the Central Valley, and Woodland is in the lower Sacramento River Delta North region. That region goes from the Fremont Weir, basically Knights Landing, downstream to Rio Vista. It covers the entire Yola bypass and the Sacramento River through Natomas, the Elkhorn Basin, West Sacramento, all the way down to past Clarksburg. The advantage of that grant is the state said, here's our 2012 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and here's funding to prepare a local vision of what the locals support to advance the goals of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in a way that would have broad local support, or as broad as possible. And the LSDN, the Lower Sac Delta North region, which was largely headed up by the land use agencies, so Yolo County, Solano County, the flood control agencies, the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, the Solano County Water Agency, and Reclamation District 2068, bringing that local RD voice to the region, prepared a report in 2015 that laid this out. And it is the comprehensive vision for flood management actions that the region is supporting, the local agencies are supporting. One of those projects is support for Lower Cache Creek feasibility study. There's also support for doing a study of protecting the eastern flank of Woodland, and that's the Yolo bypass levee through Conway Ranch. There's not a specific proposal there. The recommendation is just to do a study. But it's been brought up in some of the Citizen Advisory Committee meetings and some of the public comments and scoping of what is the comprehensive plan. That regional flood management plan is the comprehensive plan for management of floodwaters in the vicinity and adjacent to the Yolo bypass. So that brings it back to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers feasibility study, Lower Cache Creek feasibility study. It has been advancing through their milestone process. As Ken said earlier, they just completed the agency decision milestone. They're now going to proceed with finalizing their environmental impact statement. Many members of the community submitted comments on that, so you'll see the responses to your comments in that final EIS. And then sometime next summer, the Corps will finalize that study, and the Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers will issue a report to Congress making a recommendation on whether Congress should take action to authorize that project. And then as Ken also said, that's one step in the process. The city then needs to work with the state to secure a new construction start appropriation. And that leads to the funding that once you have an authorization that allows for the design to be completed, real estate acquisition to begin at the appropriate time, and then ultimately construction. And so hopefully you can see from there's a lot of steps in that process, and it's not something that is going to happen quickly. But we are making progress. And then lastly, the Woodland Flood Risk Management Project, and that's the purpose of this EIR, the scope of this EIR, and that's with funding in a grant provided by DWR. The city's been able to invest in a greater level of detail than is ordinarily constructed or ordinarily conducted as part of a Corps feasibility study. The Corps has refined and streamlined their feasibility study process to what they call 3x3. They want to do a study in 3 years for $3 million. And this study has a lot of complexities. The concerns that have been expressed in the past by community owners north of the city, how we include drainage improvements to try to move those floodwaters through that existing floodplain more quickly. And then also we're dealing with the Cache Creek Setting Basin that has trapping efficiency requirements, mercury TMDL orders from the Regional Water Quality Control Board, things that the Corps wouldn't ordinarily get to that level of detail and would have deferred to those things for design. Well, through the partnership with the state, we've been able to cost share in developing more detail than you would ordinarily see, and that's what's presented in this EIR, and ultimately the Corps included in their feasibility study. So to be clear, the Corps feasibility study and the Woodland DWR flood risk management project isn't a revival of the 2003 project. There's some very distinct differences both in the project and more importantly, the way the project performs, the impacts of that project and how those impacts are mitigated. These studies also aren't a guarantee of federal or state funding. It's very possible that we'll complete a feasibility study and Congress may not choose to authorize it, or if they authorize it, they may not appropriate money, or they may not appropriate money at a meaningful level to construct the project quickly. It's not uncommon for projects to get a trickle of funding just to keep design going, but it takes a concerted effort to get a level of appropriation that allows the project to be built in a meaningful short construction timeframe. And lastly, the projects are not a method for removing all flood risk. We're just reducing the risk, whether that's north of the city or in the city itself. That there's always the potential of having a flood larger than what the project was designed to, and the flood system could be overwhelmed. or we could have a failure of the flood system because of design, construction, or maintenance defect, or just an unknown condition. So the community will remain at risk of flooding, and the goal of the project is just to significantly reduce that risk, not just for the city, but also to the property owners north of the city. I've talked about the Urban Flood Risk Reduction Grant. The project is designed to meet state regulatory requirements. A key component that you see in the for the feasibility is that the Army Corps of Engineers is going to find a federal interest in the alternative and cost sharing. The city could choose an alternative different than what would have federal interest, but the federal government wouldn't cost share in it, or they would cost share to reduce level, meaning the city would have to come up with a lot more money. And they'd have to convince the state why the state should put up more money when the Corps has an alternative that they're willing to support. And so we went into the feasibility study, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later with the alternatives, that was a key element in identification of preferred alternative, was making sure there was going to be federal interest in bringing the federal dollars to this community, because they will pay for a majority of the design and construction costs. And then as Ken said in his introduction, the alternative, the proposed alternative includes actions for properties and structures north of the City of Woodland to ensure that they're also benefiting and that this is truly a community plan. So project objectives are to meet state 200-year flood protection requirements. In doing so, we will meet FEMA certification requirements. So at the end of this project, we'll have a levee system that is certified as meeting urban level design criteria and FEMA certification criteria. We meet the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planning criteria for federal investment. That through implementation of the project, we avoid or reduce risk associated with increases to the 100-year water surface elevation at existing structures north of the city. And that we maintain the functionality of the Cache Creek Setting Basin so that we don't adversely affect either the trapping efficiency or the mercury metallization of the soils in the basin. And then also ensure no net loss of native trees, meaning that if native trees are removed as part of construction, that they're mitigated and replaced. So the bulk of the project is located on the north side of the city. I'm going to talk about the features later. The project is intended to, as flows over top Cache Creek, largely move through the floodplain as they do under existing conditions. They come down to the improvements, and those are routed over to the Cache Creek Setting Basin and through the basin back into the Ola bypass. There's 3 alternatives considered or carried forward in the EIR. There was a very large number. I think 26 alternatives were originally considered and screened down to these 3. So we're required to look at the no project if we don't do anything. Alternative 2A is the proposed project, and alternative 2C is actually the alternative that the city initially thought coming out of the flood safe YOLO effort would meet the city's objectives, the community's objectives, but ultimately, as I'll talk about, the federal government, the Corps, did not identify it as meeting their criteria. The key differences are just fundamentally alternative 2A intercepts the floodwaters and routes them back through the settling basin. Alternative 2C creates would create a bypass channel that routes the water around the settling basin between I-5 and that existing Cache Creek Setting Basin South Levee. And so they perform a little differently, but alternative 2C is much more expensive, and that's ultimately the challenge in the Corps and why they didn't choose it as having the federal interest. So this figure shows the details of alternative 2A. There's a new levee constructed to the north of the city, along with a large drainage channel that intercepts those floodwaters and routes them to the settling basin. One of the improvements over existing conditions is that each of the roadways that go through the floodplain serve as a small dam. The water backs up on the west side of those roads, has to get deep enough to flow over the top of those roads, and that through the installation of culverts at the railroad, Road 113, Road 102, is actually an improvement over existing conditions by reducing the duration of flooding and getting those areas drained more quickly. The water goes over to the settling basin. The existing west levee of the settling basin would be degraded and a weir placed in so that water would flow, the floodwaters would flow back into the settling basin. That weir height is set high enough up that you don't have water flowing the other way. By the time the water in the settling basin gets high enough, you've already got water on that Cache Creek Settling Basin. So we'd be designed in a way that for the smaller floods, you wouldn't see the weir reverse flowing. Underneath the weir, there would be a series of culverts that would help drain that floodplain. And then there's a detention basin in the, I'm using my mouse here, in this area, where it connects to the city's existing storm drain pumping system and then drains the residual floodplain out into the Yolo bypass. So this is alternative 2C. So I talked about 2A routing the water through the Cache Creek Settling Basin. This is that bypass channel that I mentioned. A new levee is constructed between I-5 and the Cache Creek Settling Basin, and water drains this way. This portion of the Yolo bypass levee right there by that Road 126, 122?
22.
122, and the railroad would be degraded. But in dealing, the cost in dealing with the railroad, the cost in building this new longer levee system resulted in a project that was more expensive but didn't provide more benefits. And that's why the Corps didn't identify it as being the National Economic Development Plan, the plan that they would cost share in. So this is the with project floodplain. Once this project is completed, this is how the flooding would be expected to occur from overtopping. This, as I said earlier, this isn't the FEMA floodplain. This isn't the FEMA with project floodplain because FEMA does their analysis different than the Corps does. FEMA looks at a much more conservative approach of kind of what is the worst case with multiple failure scenarios and producing the maximum water surface elevation. But you can see in the hatched area that's not shaded, that's the portion of the floodplain within the city that would be removed as a result of construction of this project. So let's talk a little more about the non-structural actions north of the city. The proposed alternative 2A, would reduce flood stages and duration of flooding north of the city for most of the properties, or there's no effect at all. For the properties closer to the creek, there's no change in stage, flood depth, or duration. And so we laid out a draft plan and have asked for input, not just from the community, but from the county, and have looked for opportunities to present this to county OES so we can pursue FEMA funding in the future. We'll look at raising or flood-proofing existing structures. And so this will be done on a property owner by property owner basis. There are options for dry flood proofing where basically a flood wall that is like an erector set is constructed prior to the flood event, or the home is raised above the 100-year water surface elevation. There's some of the property immediately next to the Cache Creek Settling Basin is going to flood significantly deeper than existing conditions. I believe the bulk of that is owned by UC Davis, and there's no structures on that. For those properties where there is an increase in the depth and duration of flooding, flowage easements are proposed. And then another option is subsidizing flood insurance, and it depends on the level of impact of the project. Even the areas where there's no impact, there's proposed subsidies. And so all of this is written up in the non-structural plan. And unless Sarah says otherwise, that's an appendix to the draft
Mhm.
EIR.
Yep.
And so we welcome your comments on that, those non-structural actions as well. And as Ken said in his concluding remarks, this project is being designed assuming that the existing Cache Creek levee system continues to be maintained. Because of what we saw in 2019, the system overtopping below the advertised capacity, the city's been working with the county and the Department of Water Resources, who has that maintenance obligation, to understand why that occurred and what actions can be taken to restore the capacity. So just, it's very clear in the feasibility study, in the course feasibility study, that the proposed project depends on that existing levee system to remain in place. Finally, just want to touch on the overall CEQA schedule. So we had our public scoping meeting in September of 2019. We released our draft EIR March 23rd, 2020. Tonight's our public meeting, and we're going to close the public comment period on August 14th. We'll then respond to all the comments that we received, make any changes necessary to the EIR and finalize it. And then it'll be coming back to the City Council for consideration sometime in the late fall or early winter would be the expectation. So with that, let me turn it back over to Tim.
Thank you, Rick. First, a quick explanation of how to submit comments. So for the meeting tonight, we're taking questions from people calling in, not taking public comments during the meeting. We would like comments to be sent to me in writing. My email address is in the slide. You can also call me. My phone number isn't on all the postcards, but definitely prefer email. So you can submit comments either by mail to my address of the city or to my email address. Either of them will work. Through the end of business day on August 14th, or really any time that day will be fine.
Okay, so this is Kim Floyd taking over again, and we will open it
Kim,
to...
this is Sarah Martin.
Oh.
I wanted to say one thing. Rick had mentioned that the non-structural plan, it is actually not an appendix to the EIR, but it is referenced in the EIR, and most of the content from the non-structural plan is included in the project description.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying. Tim, is the non-structural plan on the city's website, or what's the best way to make sure that that's...
I can put it on the city's website. It's not on there right now.
Okay. So we welcome comments on the alternatives and what's included in there to make sure it's a plan that those property owners see as beneficial.
Okay, so with that, we will open it to questions. Again, please use the raise hand button, or if you're participating by phone and you have a question, you can press *9, and I will monitor the queue. I will turn the questions over to Tim to answer, or have members of the team answer. And again, we're not, these questions and the answers will not be part of the official record. And Rick, can you do me a favor, please, and go back one slide so that people have an opportunity to write down the information if they need to about how to submit written public comments. Okay. I'm not seeing any hands raised in the queue. I have one. Right.
Protocol.
So this is call-in user number 1. Go ahead, please.
Nancy Lee, Yolo County Farm Bureau. We would like to know if there will be a transcript of this meeting, or if we can access a tape version of it so our membership has an opportunity to look at it or read it.
Okay. Hi, Nancy. This is Tim Bush responding. We are recording the message. It is being recorded by Zoom onto the cloud. So we can make it available, yes. We can put a link to it on the city's website.
I definitely want to have Mr. Reinhardt's comments and available to our members, and I would like to have you tell me how I can access that in time to get it out to our membership before the comment period expires.
tonight, and it's on the Zoom command. We'll get it off of Zoom, and we'll put a link to that onto the city's website, onto the flood projects page.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Our next question will be Kathy Malanix. I'm sorry, Kathy, if I pronounced your name wrong. Kathy. You may have to unmute yourself, Kathy. No?
Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay, this is actually Betsy Spalding, Kathy's sister, but the question is, shouldn't the environmental impact be assessed on the final alignment of the plan for the flood wall? The flood wall plan that was presented in the EIR isn't obviously the final alignment, and this was really made clear last week when a member of that flood advisory committee showed up at our mother's house who has farmland that will need to be acquired for the levee in Plan 2A. And this realignment of the flood wall differs from what is in the EIR. Tim Bush had also told our family earlier that changes in the levee could happen after funding for building the wall was secured. In order for the EIR to be relevant, shouldn't it have to address the final alignment of the flood wall?
Sarah?
Mm-hmm. Hi, Betsy. This is Tim Bush responding. We did the EIR now for a couple of reasons. One, because the project has advanced to a level that we really should do that, and also to make sure that we're consistent with CEQA. The levee alignment is what it is right now. We have no actual proposed changes to it at this time. The core feasibility study is moving forward with the recommended plan. We have the 3 alternatives in the EIR. But what invariably happens as you go into actual detailed design and detailed engineering and negotiation with property owners in particular, there can be changes to the levee alignment that happen during the detailed design stage. That's going to happen somewhere between 5 and 20 years from now. At that time, what we would have to do is a supplemental EIR. There's going to be some changes between now and construction, probably changes during construction, that the supplemental EIR would pick up at that time.
Can I ask a second question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I went on mute myself. Kathy, I will come back to you. Our next in line is Trish Timothy. And Trish, you have to unmute yourself as well, please. There you go.
Okay, I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can,
Can
thank
you hear
you.
me now? Great.
Yes.
Our question is regarding there's another project, related to this project, that is happening or being planned around Huff's Corner, which is the picture that you showed earlier where it overtopped last year. And they are planning to raise that levee and widen that levee for a certain portion for additional flood protection, I suppose. I don't know what the formal objectives are, but has that project been considered in conjunction with this project so that it may have positive and or negative impacts on each other?
This is Rick Reinhardt. I'll start with that answer and then ask Sarah Martin to add any CEQA aspect of this. The Huff's Corner project that you're referring to is the portion of the Cache Creek South levee just upstream of I-5 that is maintained by the county. They're not raising the levee in the true sense that Yolo County is the maintaining agency, and they have an obligation to operate, maintain, repair, and rehabilitate that levee. Over time, it's either settled or subsided, and the levee is significantly below the design elevation that they're required to maintain it to. So they're doing this under I'll call it an extraordinary maintenance action. It's not ordinary O&M. It is a significant action they're taking, but it's to restore the levee to its design condition. That's being done as a maintaining agency, and does not have a direct relationship to this project. It's just like the point I made about the rest of the levee system that DWR is maintaining, that it also cannot pass the design capacity. It's much below what we thought the advertised capacity is, and DWR is going to have to do something similar for the rest of it. Well, I say similar. They're going to take some action to restore the capacity of Cache Creek. That could be vegetation clearing, sediment clearing, restoring levee height if it's deficient, and those things happen to meet the to maintain their obligations under their O&M agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers. Sarah, from a cumulative standpoint, can you speak to that? Does the EIR mention that project?
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
I was double muted on my phone and the computer. Does that project have a different name possibly that we might have looked at under the cumulative section?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. It's a maintenance action. It's being done as a maintenance activity with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. So I don't quite know how it's being characterized in CEQA. And
okay. Okay, well, if we can discuss this at a later time, or someone can send a comment about that, and we could, you know, if it needs to be addressed during the final, we would definitely be able to do that.
Yes, because this levee is being raised by 5 feet and widened by 15 feet. So it's much more than just maintaining the design elevations.
Yeah, I think the important thing for today's presentation is it's not a part of this project. It's being done by the county.
Well, we're being impacted by both sides. That's why I bring it up.
Understood.
But we did, of course, include the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and its management actions as a whole in the cumulative impact analysis.
So next in line was Carl Frank, and then I'll come back to our first person to ask the question. But Carl, you are unmuted.
Oh, there I am. What?
Let's see. Carl, can you?
Now, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thanks for everyone's patience. We know this is.
Thanks for leaving alternative 2C up because it gets to the heart of my question. As you can see, the wall on the western edge terminates at County Road 98. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, and if you look at alternative 2A, there is a little tail that goes out into the county. And I'm wondering why it was necessary on alternative 2A to add that tail. That goes through our property and through a neighbor's property, and I don't see a real benefit to go extending out into the county when it's a wall that's to protect the city of Woodland.
So what we don't have up is the alternative 2C. We haven't worked on since about 2015. And since that time, the Corps has been advancing the development of alternative 2A. And I suspect the difference is just refinements in understanding the residual floodplain and how we prevent the system from being outflanked. That they're extending to high ground. They want to make sure that the floodwaters don't come around here and just go around the side of this levee. And this is an issue, as Tim pointed out in the response to a previous comment, that'll be worked through in the final design. We have feasibility level hydraulic analysis. There'll be a new hydraulic analysis that's done, a hydraulic model constructed with more detail to understand exactly how we prevent this from getting outflanked. So that's why that tail is there.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to come back to, and I apologize, Kathy Melanic's sister. I did not get your name the first time, but I'm going to unmute you. You can ask your second question, please.
My name is Betsy Spalding. The second question.
Thank you, Betsy.
Yeah, I understand that the city will be in charge of the maintenance of the levee in the new flood wall. And it currently cites that it cannot maintain the existing wall. What is the plan to maintain the new wall? Will the citizens of Woodland be paying through this through increased taxes?
Betsy, this is Tim Bush. Yeah, the city would ultimately have maintenance obligation for this new levee. The state's not trying to pick up new maintenance obligations. For new levee, the maintenance actually is relatively straightforward. It's mainly vegetation maintenance, making sure there's not burrowing animals drilling into the thing, and making sure that that it maintains its overall structure over time. We are a very long ways away from actually coming up with a financial plan to maintain it, but it would be something that would be funded by the city. It could be through a tax, it could be through a benefit assessment district from properties that are removed from the floodplain. But that's it will be an obligation of the city, but that's a discussion that we'll probably have in 5 to 10 years from now.
Thank you, Tim. So our next question comes from Michael Valentine. Michael, you will need to unmute yourself as well.
All right, is that it?
That's it.
Good. I understood from looking at the draft EIR that some work would be done on the south levee of Cache Creek, including actions necessary to protect or provide some protection for the city, the town of Yolo. Do I have that right? And if I do, I want to ask a follow-up.
This is Rick Reinhardt. The core feasibility study did look at providing for protection for YOLO. And there is potential federal interest in taking action there. The county completed a small community feasibility study through a DWR grant on the actions that would be needed to provide YOLO 100-year protection. That does have a recommended plan. And since the county is a land use agency responsible for the town of YOLO, the county would need to advance that plan. You had a two-part question. You were asking about were there improvements to the south levee?
Yeah, will there be levee improvements on the south levee of Cache Creek, just downstream from the town of Yolo? And the reason I'm asking is I live on the north side, and if the south side of the creek is going to be further fortified, won't that increase our risk?
Right. As you know, hopefully you can see on the alternative 2A graphic that I have up, there's no actions on the existing Cache Creek levee system upstream of the settling basin. There are some improvements to the settling basin south levee and the southern portion of the west levee, but there are no actions proposed as part of this project on the Cache Creek levee system upstream of the settling basin.
Okay, thank you.
And Michael, we don't have any follow-up questions in the queue. You said you had a follow-up question?
I think he just got it to it.
Perfect. Okay. Just as a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, you can use the raise hand button. If you're calling in, you can press *9, and that will also raise your hand. So we do have a question. Is this Nancy Lee? Call-in user 1, go ahead. I think that's Nancy. Okay. Any other questions from anyone? I can't, for some reason.
Hello?
Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I have a question with a couple of follow-ups. First, are the real estate costs the local responsibility?
This is Rick. The real estate costs are a project cost. It is the non-federal sponsor's responsibility to acquire the lands, easements, and rights of way associated with the project. And so the city, working with the state, would acquire the land needed for the project, but the land costs themselves is included in the project cost.
Well, that's a little bit, I'm not quite able to parse that through, but let me move on to my next question. If so, if the real estate costs are part of the local share, when will these real estate costs be determined? So when locals, the city council, whomever, votes on the project, they know what they are assuming for their jurisdiction.
So in the Corps feasibility study, there's a real estate appendix that that includes the appraisal of all the lands or estimates the cost of all the lands associated with the project. And that's included in the total cost it's in the feasibility study, and that feasibility study is on the city's website.
I have read that. Then my last part of this tri-part question is, Yolo County Farm Bureau has believed since the early 2000s that the proposed project, the floodwall then, floodwall 1, floodwall 2 now, is proceeding with an unrealistic assessment of those costs because we believe, based on the fact we're farmers and we deal with land and we finance it and we fund our operations with that value, that you are negatively impacting our real estate values by hardening the floodplain and, in fact, putting us in a bypass. So assuming the courts agree with us at some point, and that cost comes in to be substantially higher than you had anticipated, what's going to happen to the project?
So Nancy, this is Rick. We, as you're aware, we hired an appraiser to come in to look at how land values will change because those lands are currently in the 100-year floodplain. The appraiser looked at how the depth and duration of flooding would change on those properties. And other than the ones where we're proposing a flowage easement where the flood depth is significantly greater adjacent to the settling basin, the appraiser determined that there was no change in value for those lands. The Army Corps of Engineers real estate office reached the same conclusion. And so the Army Corps and the city, based on independent review by real estate experts, have concluded that there isn't an adverse impact on the land values and that the land costs that are in the feasibility study are our best estimate of what the real estate costs will be for this project.
May I add one more comment? Yes or no?
Well, we are trying to limit this to questions for clarification.
All right.
Public comments, we really appreciate comments in writing.
Well, you will receive those, but I want you to recognize that this may be a litigatable subject. I am a lawyer. I can hire an expert. You can hire an expert. And if we're looking at substantial loss of value, which limits our ability to farm here, at some point, someone's going to have to pay that cost. And I just want you to know that moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Do we have any other questions? Again, if you're calling in on the phone, *9, or if you're participating by computer, you can raise your hand through the raise hand button. Rick, would you mind going back to the slide where you have the contact information for submitting? There we go. This information is also on the website. So as a reminder, written comments must be submitted by August 14th by mail or by email. And if you have an issue or a concern, you can contact Tim Bush through Public Utilities and talk with him about getting your comments submitted. Two more questions, or actually I had one just disappear. Betsy, you have another question? You'll have to unmute yourself. Waiting for Betsy to unmute.
Can
There
you hear
go.
me now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, this is actually Kathy Mullenix. I was,
Oh, sorry. Okay,
I know,
sorry.
we're confusing here. I was curious
Okay.
how you came up with your project objectives that you showed on your PowerPoint, because you listed like do not harm native trees, but you don't have anything about, you know, harming prime ag land. And I was curious about how you came up with this list. Because this project will harm prime ag land.
Sarah, I'm having a little difficulty remembering how we characterize impacts to agricultural land in the environmental document. Can you speak to it, or do we need to just ask that it be submitted as a comment that or a question that we can follow up on later?
No, I can tell you that we do find there to be a significant and unavoidable impact to prime farmland from the loss of farmland that's going to go under the actual structure of the new levee and the drainage channel.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Of course, there's a mitigation measure provided for that, which is to conserve prime farmland in conservation easements, but you know, there's always a discussion that's not actually like creating any new farmland, so it doesn't reduce it to the level of less than significant, so it's significant and unavoidable.
All right, I do not see at this time any other questions. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Tim. We can just wrap this up and thank everyone for participating this evening.
Hi, this is Tim Bush again. Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for calling in or zooming into the meeting tonight. And like I said, if you have any questions, please get a hold of me. I prefer by email. And feel free to send in whatever comments you would like us to consider in the EIR by August 14th. Again, thank you and have a good night.
Thank you.